The Palace of Versailles remains the world's standard for opulence, power, and high culture. It was the personal creation of Louis XIV, the Sun King, who stood as the absolute arbiter of European fashion and royal splendor. That is the shining, gilded myth that defined his era. The grotesque truth, hidden beneath the thick layers of perfume and silk, is that Versailles was a palace of unimaginable filth, human waste, and unbearable stench. And the source of this aristocratic rot was the king himself. Louis XIV, due to prevailing medical fears of the time, almost never bathed. Some historical estimates suggest he took only 3 full baths in his adult life. This complete absence of hygiene, combined with a diet of rich, sugary foods, turned the most magnificent monarch into a living source of disease, boils, and pervasive odor. The great secret of the French court is that the nobility who copied the king in all things were forced to live and work in a constant state of grotesque, suppressed nausea. The greatest secret of the Sun King's court is that the magnificent French perfume industry was born not from vanity, but from a desperate, urgent need to mask the royal stench. Don't you dare look away. Watch this entire deep dive documentary and subscribe to Crown of Dread, and you will learn the one secret about his final illness that proves the king died of the filth he himself created. The agonizing core of the king's hidden medical suffering was a horrifying septic condition that required a barber surgeon to operate on his most private part. Beyond the stench and the grime, Louis XIV suffered from a devastating medical condition that provided constant, agonizing pain and deeply influenced his temper: a severe anal fistula. This painful, septic abscess near the anus was a constant source of infection and immense, throbbing agony. The pain from the fistula was so intense that the king, the most powerful man in Europe, could barely sit down, ride a horse, or maintain his usual rigid composure during court ceremonies. His physical suffering was relentless, and the only people who knew the true extent of his agony were his personal barber surgeon and the queen. The medical response was a barbaric, life-threatening surgical procedure performed in 1686, known as the Operation of the Grand Monarch. The royal barber surgeon Charles-François Félix was tasked with cutting out the abscess. The surgery was performed without proper anesthesia, and the king had to endure the excruciating pain of the knife in his most sensitive area. The success of this operation was celebrated across Europe, but the pain and the underlying hygienic problems that caused it remained. This event shows the ultimate vulnerability of absolute power to simple biology. The king's physical agony was a private political crisis, proving that even divine right cannot stop a septic infection. This intimate suffering dictated the mood of an entire continent. But the shame of the fistula was compounded by another disgusting secret: the terrifying state of the king's teeth. The king's passion for sugar, a new, expensive commodity that symbolized his immense wealth, combined with his aversion to water and cleaning, led to a horrifying, irreversible decay of his entire mouth. His vanity demanded a rich diet, but his hygiene habits sealed his fate. By the age of 40, Louis XIV suffered from such massive dental rot that his own dentists were forced to extract all of his teeth in his upper jaw. The subsequent surgery was a disaster. A large piece of his upper jawbone was accidentally removed, creating a fistula, a hole between his mouth and his nasal cavity. This medical nightmare meant that whenever the king drank, the liquid would agonizingly leak out through his nose. His doctors, in a desperate attempt to fix the problem, resorted to cauterizing the hole with a red-hot iron, a procedure that often caused the king to collapse in agony. The most magnificent voice in Europe was silenced by dental decay. This is the ultimate historical example of vanity causing physical self-destruction. The king's refusal to accept basic cleanliness, driven by aristocratic arrogance, led to years of agonizing, self-inflicted medical torture. proving that pride is often the fastest path to physical ruin. But the secret filth of the king was reflected in the very structure of Versailles, a palace of golden illusion built upon a terrifying, unsanitary lie. Versailles was a stunning architectural achievement, but its function as a central residence for 10,000 nobles, servants, and officials exposed a grotesque reality. The palace had virtually no indoor plumbing or sanitary facilities for the masses. Due to the sheer number of inhabitants and the lack of proper sewage systems, courtiers and nobles often treated the palace's magnificent halls, stairwells, and gardens as their personal latrines. Accounts confirm that human waste was a pervasive problem, often visible and smelled throughout the palace, despite the lavish use of French perfumes. The famous carpets and velvet tapestries often concealed unimaginable filth. The king's grand design, forcing the nobility to live at Versailles to control them, had a horrifying side effect. He forced them to live in a gilded sewer. The nobility, mirroring the king's own disdain for bathing, simply accepted the filth as part of aristocratic life. This demonstrates the historical paradox of unchecked opulence and systemic decay. Versailles proves that wealth and grandeur cannot overcome basic infrastructural failure, and that the arrogance of an elite class often leads them to tolerate conditions that would horrify the poorest citizens. But the most perverse ritual of the king's day was tied to the constant, pervasive presence of his stool, a piece of furniture that became a terrifying symbol of status. The final, most bizarre humiliation of Versailles was the ritualistic elevation of the stool, commode. Because the king's life was a public spectacle, even his most private needs became a tool of political control. The ultimate sign of royal favor was to be admitted to the king's private chamber while he was sitting on his commode, conducting his most private needs. This privilege, reserved for the highest-ranking nobles, was known as the entrée de la chaise, the entrance of the chair. The noble would stand before the king, discussing politics or finance, while the monarch conducted his business. This ritual was designed to emphasize the king's absolute godlike power. Even in his most vulnerable and human state, the noble had to maintain absolute deference. The commode, a disgusting necessity, was transformed into a terrifying symbol of supreme royal favor. This ritual demonstrates the psychological extremism of absolute monarchy. The king intentionally broke all boundaries of human decency to enforce his divine status, showing that rulers will use any means necessary, including ritualized humiliation, to maintain a terrifying distance from their subjects. We have traced the filth and the pain, but the ultimate darkest secret remains: the final terrifying medical procedure that the royal surgeons performed on the king's body to attempt to fix his physical collapse. The pervasive stench of Versailles, a mix of human and animal waste, stale food, and unwashed bodies, was a constant, profound embarrassment to the Sun King. His solution was not hygiene, but artifice. Louis XIV pioneered the extensive, lavish use of perfumes, not as a luxury, but as a political necessity. The French perfume industry experienced an explosive boom during Louis XIV's reign, specifically because the nobility stopped bathing entirely. The common joke of the time was that the king had bathed more in the blood of his enemies than in water. The perfumes, heavy, complex mixtures of musk, ambergris, and floral essences, were created solely to mask the stench of unwashed flesh and the pervasive odor of the palace itself. The king commanded his personal perfumer to create a new, distinct scent for him every day, and often requested that his royal mistresses and furniture be heavily perfumed. This ritual of masking became a terrifying symbol. The most magnificent culture in Europe was founded on a denial of its own disgusting physical reality. This is the ultimate historical example of brand over substance. The French court proved that the image of opulence can be maintained indefinitely, even when the underlying reality is catastrophic filth, a principle that is constantly tested in modern marketing and political propaganda. But the most perverse ritual the king inflicted on his children was a horrifying daily practice tied to the belief in the sanctity of his own body. Louis XIV enforced a bizarre, almost cult-like belief in the sacred curative power of his own body. This led to a daily, humiliating ritual that was inflicted upon his own children and courtiers. The king's doctors and spiritual advisors believed that the royal saliva held curative powers. Therefore, the king would sometimes perform a ritual where he would spit directly onto his own children or onto the wounds of petitioners who sought his divine healing touch. This was not considered a gesture of contempt, but an act of divine purifying grace. The children and courtiers were forced to receive this act with absolute reverence, ignoring the obvious, disgusting truth that the king's mouth, filled with rotten teeth and connected by a hole to his nose, was anything but pure. They were compelled to participate in the king's delusion. This illustrates the terrifying psychological power of institutionalized self-worship. The king's body became a religious relic, showing that systems of absolute power can force the elite to participate in the most humiliating and bizarre rituals to maintain the ruler's godlike status. But the true depth of the king's personal filth was revealed in a horrifying medical incident involving his wigs and a parasitic plague. The king's famous, elaborate powdered wigs, perruques, were not just a fashion statement. They were a complex form of camouflage designed to hide the signs of disease and, most tellingly, the king's own profound lack of hygiene. Due to the lack of washing, Louis XIV and his court suffered from pervasive infestations of lice and fleas. The huge powdered wigs, worn constantly by both men and women, became perfect warm breeding grounds for these parasites. The wigs were not cleaned or replaced frequently, turning them into mobile nests of filth. The sound of scratching was often a feature of the king's court, although courtiers would attempt to perform the act subtly. The wigs were the king's greatest defense against the visible evidence of his filth, allowing him to maintain the illusion of divine perfection while literally hosting a parasitic plague beneath his magnificent facade. This is the ultimate historical example of status-masking biological decay. The king's vanity forced him to maintain an expensive accessory that actively concealed a serious health and hygiene failure, proving that image often takes precedence over reality in the ruling class. But the king's most dangerous habit was a terrifying, secret addiction that controlled his mood and his actions for decades. The sheer volume of pain endured by Louis XIV from his dental fistulas and the recurring problems with his fistula surgery forced him into a secret dependence that ruled his actions and dictated his temper. Opiate addiction. The king was regularly administered massive doses of laudanum, a tincture of opium, to manage the relentless, throbbing pain from his abscesses and surgical sites. This chronic use of opiates severely affected his mood, causing periods of deep melancholy, paranoia, and sudden, irrational rage toward his ministers and family. His personal physicians were aware of the addiction, but were politically forced to maintain the supply, knowing that the king's pain and the resulting withdrawal would be catastrophic for the stability of the state. The most powerful man in Europe was effectively addicted to pain medication, his sanity hanging on the next prescribed dose. This situation illustrates the historical precedent of substance abuse in positions of ultimate power. It shows that even the most controlled political systems are vulnerable to the human weaknesses of its leaders, and that the private addictions of a ruler can directly influence global politics. But the final terrifying secret of the king's body was a bizarre medical ritual designed to prevent the poisoning of his own feces, a sign of extreme paranoia. The king's paranoia, fueled by the opiate addiction and the constant threat of poison, reached its peak in a bizarre, humiliating ritual surrounding his waist. He feared that his political enemies might use his feces for black magic rituals or for evidence of his physical decay. After the king utilized his commode, the chair of honor, his personal valets were required to perform a specific, formalized ritual of disposal. They were commanded to inspect the contents and then treat the waste with chemicals before disposal. The most extreme versions of this account suggest that the waste was sometimes ritually burned to ensure it could not fall into the hands of a sorcerer or an enemy physician. This ritual of paranoia demonstrates the terrifying isolation of the absolute ruler. The king, fearing betrayal from every corner, extended his defensive measures to the most private, ignoble parts of his life. He was convinced that even his own bodily waste could be weaponized against him. This is the ultimate historical evidence of paranoia consuming the ruler's privacy. The king's fear of public exposure, of his health decay, was so great that he turned a simple bodily function into a national security ritual, proving that the burden of absolute power is inescapable. We have traced the filth, the pain, and the paranoia. But the final, darkest secret of the Sun King remains: the terrifying final medical procedure that the royal surgeons performed on his body to attempt to fix his physical collapse. The Bourbon dynasty's ultimate vulnerability was the fragility of its heirs. Despite the rigorous political control and the efforts to secure the bloodline, the line of succession was plagued by devastating illness and sudden death, leading to a profound sense of doom within the court. The Dauphin, the king's son, and the Grand Dauphin, the king's grandson, the direct heirs to Louis XIV, both died suddenly within a short period, leaving the throne to a great-grandson, the child, Louis XVII. These deaths were officially ruled malignant fever. However, historical analysis suggests that the rapid elimination of 3 direct heirs was too convenient for the political rivals. The most potent theory points to systematic poisoning, the work of the suppressed poisoning networks that continued to operate after the affair of the poisons. The targets were likely too high-ranking to be exposed, so their deaths were quickly covered up as natural illness. The elimination of 3 generations of direct heirs in quick succession proves that the most ruthless assassins were willing to risk everything to control the future of France. This is the historical equivalent of decapitating the corporate ladder. It shows that in a regime built on personality, eliminating the leadership pipeline is the most effective way to seize power, proving that institutional stability is always weaker than ruthless individual ambition. But the most terrifying secret of the French harem was the quiet political practice of enforced sterility, a betrayal of the women's bodies to protect the throne. The French crown utilized every aspect of court life for political control, including the private lives of the royal women. The most disturbing truth of the harem was the political manipulation of reproduction, specifically the deliberate use of enforced sterility on women who were deemed politically dangerous. If a concubine or a low-ranking consort gained the king's affection but belonged to a politically threatening noble faction, the powerful queen or a minister might intervene. The historical record suggests the use of subtle, natural abortifacients or sterilization agents administered through herbal medicines, disguised as health tonics. The goal was to ensure the woman remained a pleasure object, but could not produce a royal heir who might become a focal point for the opposition. The women were often unaware they were being subjected to this political violence. Their bodies were treated as mere instruments of statecraft, their reproductive health controlled by the ruthless machinations of the court. This demonstrates the historical horror of using medicine for political control over women's bodies. The French court proves that the state will use the most intimate methods to manage succession and power dynamics, revealing a universal pattern of institutional control over human biology. But the final, crushing secret of the Sun King's reign was the massive, hidden financial catastrophe that the lavish splendor of Versailles was built upon. The Hall of Mirrors, the fountains, the endless parties, the lavish splendor of Versailles was not a display of wealth. It was a terrifying monument to national debt. The absolute monarchy was spending itself into oblivion. Louis XIV's endless wars, combined with the astronomical maintenance costs of the court, drained the French treasury. The king's finances were so precarious that he often resorted to bizarre, humiliating methods of fundraising, melting down silver furniture, debasing the currency, and selling new noble titles. The crown was openly desperate for money. The ultimate betrayal was that the nobility, who lived in unprecedented luxury at Versailles, were exempt from most taxes. The burden of the debt fell entirely upon the peasantry and the middle class, fueling the resentment that would eventually explode in the revolution. This illustrates the terrifying historical pattern of regime self-interest leading to economic collapse. When a ruling class becomes completely detached from the financial reality of its citizens, the system inevitably collapses under the weight of its own unsustainable privilege. But the king's final secret involved his body, a medically bizarre affliction that was caused by his own vanity and almost led to his death. For all his splendor, Louis XIV, the Sun King, suffered from a horrific and medically bizarre affliction directly linked to the vanity of his court: his teeth. The king's vanity demanded a highly sugared diet and elaborate oral hygiene, or lack thereof, leading to devastating consequences. Due to pervasive dental decay, Louis XIV suffered from a massive dental abscess that led to the agonizing, life-threatening procedure of having all his upper teeth removed. The subsequent surgery was a medical disaster. A large part of his jawbone was removed, causing a fistula, a hole, between his mouth and his nasal cavity. For years, any liquid Louis XIV drank would painfully leak out through his nose. His doctors, terrified of failing the absolute monarch, resorted to cauterizing the hole with a red-hot iron, a procedure that often caused the king to collapse in agony. The most powerful man in Europe was constantly fighting the pain of his own rotten teeth and a burning iron. This highlights the historical reality that vanity often comes at a horrifying physical cost. The pursuit of the perfect image and the accompanying rich diet subjected the king to years of unimaginable self-inflicted medical torture, a terrifying balance between image and decay. We have witnessed the hidden murders, the debt, and the decay. Now, for the final critical verdict, we must confront the moral cost of Versailles. We have unsealed the secrets of Versailles, the chilling reality of the affair of the poisons, the political murders of the Dauphin, the systematic humiliation of the Queen, and the agonizing physical decay of the Sun King himself. The crown of dread in France was not overthrown by external force. It rotted from within, consumed by its own privilege, debt, and the hidden poison of its aristocracy. The pursuit of absolute power led to a system where murder was a political tool, and the health of the heir was secondary to the purity of the bloodline. We have revealed the entire horrifying truth. But now, we turn the final question to you, the crown of dread audience. The French monarchy systematically permitted and covered up political murder, poisoning, and created catastrophic national debt to preserve the illusion of its absolute power. Was the subsequent French Revolution, with its terrifying bloodshed and chaos, the only possible and morally justifiable outcome for a system that had so ruthlessly destroyed its own people and corrupted its own soul? Let the world know your verdict. Drop your opinion in the comments below. Subscribe to Crown of Dread for more hidden history. And join us next time as we unearth the terrifying stories of blood and betrayal from the hidden courts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire.